You're listening to the Good Old Boys Fantasy Football Podcast. Now here's your hosts, Kevin, Derek, and Alex.
All right, welcome in, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Good Old Boys Fantasy Football Podcast. I am Derek, and joined as always by your co-host, Kevin. Kevin, how we doing tonight?
I'm doing good, man. Doing good. Walked out of the 4th of July weekend with all my digits, so I'm happy about that. Got to get out of the state here and go see the Outlaws. So had a great time. So now I'm back in the saddle, back to the normal grind, back to this grind as we really only have a couple weeks left before football is like ever present. So definitely starting to hit some of the best ball drafts a little bit harder here. Starting to pop into some random redraft leagues, if you will. I might have joined an extra dynasty or two. No telling, but no, I'm living my best life right now, man. How you been?
No complaints, right? We got lots of things starting to kind of cook up here. We're getting ready to start releasing some of these individual player profile videos and get those rocking and rolling. So that'll be good. Help folks kind of get ready when they're, getting close to being on the clock and getting the boys' thoughts there about the players that they're staring down, almost getting ready to draft there. So it'll be good. It'll be fun. We got we got a fun episode tonight too. We're going to be looking at kind of those wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 type of guys here tonight when we're looking at ADP 20 through 40 when it's all said and done for the wide receiver position. And then there's just some good stuff cooking here. And Alex had got caught up with some JOB stuff, so hopefully we'll see him back here next week. But the JOB stuff, man. But anyway, any news or notes that you want to hit up here?
Nothing. It's been pretty quiet. Like I haven't noticed anything major coming across. I read an article right before we jumped on that the player formerly known as Josh Allen of the Jacksonville Jaguars has legally changed his name to Joshua Hines Allen. So
Okay.
apparently didn't want to be compared to the quarterback up there in Buffalo anymore. So legally changed his name. So it should, as long as all the sites update, if you haven't drafted yet, there should be one less potential for a mistake on draft day.
Yeah, especially if you were doing some of those leagues that have IDP, or some of the ones like we do where it's you have to actually draft defensive linemen and linebackers, and you have to actually draft defensive positions in there as well as your offensive positions for that. So yeah, those have been interesting there, right? You've got the Josh Allen, the Bijan and Brian Robinson fiascos.
The B Robinson. Yep, that was real.
Yep, those have been interesting to see some of those come through as well. So, just one of those that make sure that you're paying attention, that you're reading more than just the first initial on some of these sites when it comes to drafting, and you're looking at making sure you're getting the right guy there. So, first tip of the night there. So awesome. Any other kind of news notes, anything like that stand out?
No, nothing I can think of. Everybody looks good right now, right? Everybody looks strong. Everybody looks quick. A lot of coach speak. Nothing major, either vaulting or damning players that would affect draft status. So it's just kind of is what it is, right? You're sifting through it until the players really get back into the swing of things, and training camp starts, and then you start getting reports of he's out of shape. Well, 2 months ago you said he looked fast. Like the guy just quit exercising in the 6 weeks of downtime between OTAs and training camp. But
Right.
I mean, whatever, we'll get to that. But no, man, I'm ready to get after it. Talk about some wide receivers that are going to be impactful to your fantasy rosters here this year.
Right. That one always, you hit the nail on the head. That one always cracks me up, right? You see the reports come out like 2-3 weeks before some of these training camps kick off, and looks so much bigger and stronger, and then it's gets it, and the actual reports start coming out. So it is always very interesting to see the coach speak and the some of the the press clippings, so to speak, is at this time of year. So don't necessarily fall into the hype. Let's wait a little bit longer here till we start seeing some more reports come out there. But yeah, if there's any other thoughts before we start jumping into the into wide receivers.
No, let's do it.
All right, let's go ahead and start up with Jordan Addison. And Jordan Addison, coming off of his rookie, pretty strong rookie year that he had last season, and last year he had 70 receptions, 108 targets for 911 yards and 10 touchdowns. Thoughts on Jordan Addison?
Addison was a great pickup, right? I mean, he did go drafted, and really from the get-go, you saw that he was going to be impactful to your fantasy roster. Obviously, with Jefferson missing some time, became even more impactful, but really did perform like a solid wide receiver too. Had some really good weeks, had some weeks where maybe not so much, right? Disappeared a little bit. One target, no catches in week 4 against Carolina. Was really the low point, but other than that, he was consistently getting you something. Week 14 at Las Vegas left a little to be desired, right? He had a snap share of 96%, but only saw 3 targets for 27 yards. Okay, again, rookie year, everything else, but all things considered, Addison was a good play, and I think he's going to be a solid play this year. I would expect some regression, not having Kirk Cousins under center. Justin Jefferson is still going to demand an awful lot of the ball, but Jordan Addison should be a heavy focal point of the offense, especially with T.J. Hawkinson being kind of slowly recovering everything else. So we could see some Jordan Addison get involved early and take a little bit of pressure off of Sam Darnold or J.J. McCarthy.
Right, and that's really kind of the question as to who will be under center to start the season, right? And I do think that we probably will see a Sam Darnold, kind of starts, and then the transition to JJ McCarthy there as the season kind of goes along there. But both of those guys, right? I think we do see the regression from what we saw with Kirk Cousins in this offense with Jordan Addison last year. Although Jordan Addison still put up some pretty good finishes, even with the cast of characters that the Minnesota Vikings ran out at quarterback after Kirk Cousins went down. Some of those kind of boom weeks were definitely, aided by the fact that that Justin Jefferson was out and injured there. But the fact still remains that TJ Hawkinson coming back here, I think you're right. I think we will see some, some potential more potential targets kind of heading that way there on this one. But a little bit of a new look offense here for certain on this one, where he's kind of coming off the board right now at wide receiver 40 off the board, coming off as kind of an 82nd overall type of pick. There's some of that I wouldn't mind going that route, but there's some other guys around there that I certainly wouldn't mind pulling the trigger on there as well. But if you're taking Jordan Addison as your third or even your fourth wide receiver on that one, that's some good depth for you there, and I think that that one can certainly pan out for you. Any other thoughts on Jordan Addison?
No, I co-sign to that. I think where he's going to struggle probably most is going to be the touchdown regression. I do not see him having 10 touchdowns again this season, regardless of who the quarterback is. I think we could see him get to, somewhere between 850 and 900 yards again. Like, I do think that's well within the range of possibilities. This Minnesota team, we expect to be trailing a lot. They're going to have tough matchups and most likely be trailing against Detroit, against Green Bay. The games against Chicago have always been interesting lately with the Vikings. So, there's obviously the divisional opponents, but I think there's going to be opportunity for Jordan Addison. But I think ultimately where you're really going to see him come back down to earth is the touchdown numbers. Like, it wouldn't surprise me to see him slip all the way down to 6 touchdowns. And if that's the case, you're pretty much getting him right at value. The loss of 4 touchdowns, maybe a little bit in yardage or whatnot, but I mean, it's right there in kind of that 37 to 40 range, right? That fringe wide receiver 3. It'll be a good flex play, especially some weeks. God forbid Justin Jefferson go down again, and I think you'll see Addison take another tick up as he increases that. But the caliber of quarterback in Minnesota this year, in better in some regards, worse in others, right? Depending on kind of how you want to look at it. So, you know, I think his ceiling is where he finished last year at about wide receiver 21. I think that's the cap for this current season as we try and sort some things out. But I also think the floor, it could very well be around 40, right? So somewhere in there. So maybe you are drafting a little bit closer to the floor. So I think it gives you a nice range to play with and a decent value there, 82 overall.
Yeah. All right, I like it. Let's go ahead and talk about Rashee Rice. And Rashee Rice last season, 79 receptions, 102 targets, 938 yards, and 7 touchdowns. Thoughts on Rashee Rice?
Rashee Rice was really emerging as Patrick Mahomes' go-to wide receiver last year. Towards the tail end of the season, really started to pick things up after the bye week. Weeks 11 through, he didn't play 18, so weeks 11 through 17, really solid, solid performances. 5 for 4, 10 for 8, 9 for 8, 10 for 7, 9 for 9, 12 for 6, and 6 for 5 to kind of end up his season. In that stretch, he had 2 games over 100 yards and 3 touchdowns to boot. So good usage out of him to come down the stretch, where you needed him to be able to plug him in as a nice little flex play to kind of help get you over the hump there. My biggest problem with Rashee Rice is we still have not heard what is going to be going down because of this incident in Dallas. So, we do know that he's not going to be charged with assault for the photographer back in May, but what we don't know is the car crash. It's going to be a multi-game suspension. I don't know what that looks like. So at the moment, I have him way farther down my draft board because I don't want to get caught surprised. Now, closer to draft season, if you're not watching this live, maybe you have a better idea at your current point in time of what his suspension looks like than I do here on, June 9th. But at the moment, I have him much further down my board because I'm not going to draft a player inside the top 40 who has the potential to miss 4, 6, or even 8 games in a season.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot to be said, and a lot of things that should cause some hesitation if you're down there, trying to taking a guy as your third or fourth wide receiver in that case, and likely going to miss some time there. Not only that, but there's also some of the fact that they went out and they signed Hollywood Brown, former first round pick, here, and they also spent a first round pick on a second round pick on, no, it was the first round pick on Xavier Worthy. My apologies. To bring him in there as well. So they've got a couple of guys to help stretch the field now as well, and you've got Travis Kelce in there as well. So this is one of those that you're starting to see the Chiefs kind of stack up a little bit again here on some potential wide receiver options. And so one of those that even if the suspension isn't that the time missed isn't necessarily as bad as we might think here, there's still some of that's what does this team look like, and where are they, where have they gelled at, and where are they operating at, should he return after missing games there, and what does that kind of play in there, and how does that change the dynamic of that one? So this is one of those that's certainly a very talented player, but a guy that I'm probably not going to be drafting really kind of inside the top 100 at this point. So kind of way overdrafted in my book here as far as where ADP shows. And that, I leave that open to potential change there, depending upon some more of the information that we may find, as the season approaches. But at this time, Rashee Rice is almost on a do not draft list for me. Any additional thoughts?
I think what I'm going to add additionally is Rashee Rice. The reason he worked last year is because he was able to read defenses appropriately, and his teams were playing zone against Kansas City to not let Mahomes get outside the pocket, to try and keep everything in front of them. Rice did a very good job of settling down in the soft spots of those zones. So I I very much still have interest in him this season, but much like you said, I'm probably going to let someone draft him and get bored with him and try and see if I can wait them out almost, right? Maybe wait a week or two before suspension's up and then see where I'm at with my wide receiver depth. And if I need to make a play, maybe go for it there via trade or something like that. But um, very much along the same lines. I'm not going to take that gamble and have him sit on my roster all that time for nothing. So I'm going to let someone else do that. And then if I really feel like I need that piece that he can be, again, we saw what he turned into the last bit of the year. Mahomes felt very comfortable with him. So he's at the team facilities or has been at the team facilities doing these things. So as long as he's at training camp and he's allowed to participate through training camp in the preseason, and we can kind of get an idea of how he looks, I am going to keep an eye on him and kind of put him on a watch later in the season type list. But draft day, I'm going to pass. It's just too much risk, and I don't want to deal with that to start the season.
Right. It's one of those that he probably, I could very much see somebody that wasn't necessarily paying attention in a league, something like that, reaching on him a little bit because of they recognize the name, they recognize the team, and they they go that route there. So I think that we're going to see Rashee Rice overdrafted for sure when this thing's all said and done. But
yeah, he has top 14 potential.
Correct.
Right? Like he can be a fringe wide receiver one. He's not going to be getting up into the leagues of Tyreek Hill and Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb. He's not. So hear me when I'm saying that, but he does have the potential of climbing up and being in that realm of wide receiver 12 through 15.
Right.
And that's the type of potential you're getting with him. That's the potential that he flashed at the tail end of last season. So if you are one to gamble, that's what the gamble is, right? You're saying, I don't need him at the beginning. I feel like I drafted well enough to this point to field my lineup and do what I need to do, but I want to use him for when he's back, depending on the length of suspension again. Maybe this is what helps get you through bye weeks. Maybe this is what helps you get through some injuries. But
right.
It's just kind of one of those things that I am wary about it, and I'm definitely gonna be watching it because if he has to stay away from the team during his suspension, right? Like that's NFL policy. But then as he's starting to ramp up to come back, if I catch any wind that his hamstrings are sore, that he's nursing an injury, a soft tissue injury of any kind, I'm officially out because when those linger in the middle of the season, it's really the start of the season for that player, and it's not going to get any better. It's only going to get worse.
Right. All right, let's take a look at Deontay Johnson. And Deontay Johnson coming over to the Panthers from Pittsburgh last season, where he had 51 receptions on 87 targets, 717 yards, and 5 touchdowns last season. Thoughts on Deontay Johnson?
I suspect Deontay Johnson will go back to his wide receiver 2 form, or at least fringe wide receiver 2 form. So I do think that there's some value here with Deontay Johnson. I feel like he's going to get peppered with a ton of targets in Carolina as they're trying to put these pieces around Bryce Young and allow him to take kind of this sophomore leap, if you will, after a really disappointing rookie season. So Deontay Johnson's an interesting one for me because I'm not necessarily going after this guy at all. But if I'm in a PPR league, he does pose a good amount of interest because of the volume that I think he will see. I would not be shocked to see him with over 120 targets this year. But what I'm not sure of is what that actually relates to. Like I could see him with 120 targets for, 87 grabs and 900 yards and 3 touchdowns. Like that doesn't seem completely far-fetched for me. Maybe he gets a little bit higher on the touchdown board. If that's the case, yeah, then he keeps creeping up. If he's, a little bit lighter on the touchdowns, like he was a couple seasons ago, where he had 0, big shocker. But still, nevertheless, he had 0. He probably only creeps up to, a couple spots here to, wide receiver, 33. Plays more in that wide receiver 3 territory instead of up in that fringe wide receiver 2 territory.
Right. And I think there's that's kind of you hit the nail on the head, right? That really kind of comes down to, where he's going to finish is going to be dependent upon how many of those touchdown grabs that he gets, right? And when it's, with that being the case, like with Adam Thielen also being there, like Adam Thielen just finds a way to get in the end zone and somehow and be that kind of big body possession wide receiver that they use, on those short kind of touchdown grabs there. So, yeah, this is one of those though that I do think that they brought him in to try and play and help the development there. So I think you're right. It wouldn't necessarily surprise me to see Deontay Johnson get somewhere, even north of 120. Like it would not surprise me if we look up at the end of the season, we see him with, closer to 140 targets when this thing's all said and done. Now, that's that for most wide receivers, when you're talking 140 targets, like that's kind of that magical sweet spot when they start getting peppered with that many targets that you start talking about, being able to get into wide receiver, 2 territory, potentially even wide receiver 1 territory. When you're peppered with that many targets. That has not necessarily been the case for Deontay Johnson throughout his career, right? Like there's been several seasons we've seen him get to 140 targets and him finish even outside of wide receiver 2 territory. So this is one of those that I think that you are getting, you're definitely kind of drafting him a little bit more at a floor side of things here. There is some potential upside, but it is going to be kind of capped by how many touchdowns that come in there. So this is one of those that's I could see him. There's the potential to get all the way up into wide receiver 15 through 20, kind of in that range. But I think more than likely where he'll finish is going to be closer to a wide receiver 35. So some potential value baked in there. Any other thoughts on Deontay Johnson?
No, it's a contract year. We do like guys on a contract year.
It's true.
So he was traded, and the Panthers have not extended him yet. So at the moment, he's playing on a 1-year prove-it deal, which we
like
on this show always like to believe that there's a little bit of incentive there, right, for a guy to go out and show, because he potentially has a big payday coming his way if he's able to really emerge as kind of that clear guy for Carolina going forward to help out Bryce Young. But ball's going to be in his court.
Right. All right. I like it. All right. DeAndre Hopkins next up here. DeAndre Hopkins, last season, 75 receptions, 137 targets, 1,057 yards, and 7 touchdowns. Thoughts on DeAndre Hopkins?
I see no reason why he can't duplicate these numbers. Like, just plain and simple. Yes, he's 32, but Tennessee's kind of turned over, right? Will Levis is more of a gunslinger. They wanted to put weapons around him. They've essentially done that. We're talking about a couple different Titans here tonight in this range. Hopkins being the wily veteran and working with young quarterbacks before, like, I think there's something there that is just going to end up working out for him. So I like this for Hopkins. I think that, his first year in Tennessee showed some of that rapport with Will Levis. I think he's able to kind of capitalize on that. So I wouldn't be surprised to see his numbers look, eerily similar. And if Levis can improve on his accuracy a little bit, you take it from 137, call it 125 targets, but you could actually see his receptions jump up by 10 or even 15 on, 15 less targets, become a little bit more efficient. And then, holy smokes, we got something cooking here. So I think there's a lot of good value with Hopkins here, being able to get him at wide receiver 37. Because I do think that he's probably going about 30 picks later than what he needs to be. So about a 3-round discount. 2.5 round discount that you're really getting on Hopkins for where I think he's going to end up.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot. I think there's a lot to that, right? Um, that we're going to see a new look Titans when it comes down to it, right? Like this is not going to be the very run heavy offense that we've seen in the past. Yet, in fact, the running backs that they have there wouldn't necessarily lean on that. Being the case for a run heavy type of offense there as well. So I think that we are going to see a little bit more airing it out, a little bit more, balls in the air here. And with that being the case, right, DeAndre Hopkins was able to command a 28% target share last year. And again, this is one of those that while they brought in additional competition, right, like Calvin Ridley's there as well. So you've got two guys that can be the wide receiver one for a team. And I think we're going to see some very interesting things with these two on the field here. But that being the case, right? Like even if the target share goes down to 24-25%, but there's another 150 balls being thrown throughout the season, like there's a lot of room for DeAndre Hopkins to be able to get a lot of targets in this one, and he's still still has some of the best hands in the league when it comes down to it. So it wouldn't surprise me that we see DeAndre Hopkins kind of rinse and repeat this season here. Potential. The only thing that kind of makes me a little nervous there is that touchdown number 7. It wouldn't surprise me if we see that regress back maybe to 5 or 6 here. But again, I could very much see 1,000-yard receiving season, all of that. So very similar output to what we saw this past year. Any other thoughts on DeAndre Hopkins?
Almost had one there. Also another guy on a contract year.
Correct. Awesome. All righty, let's take a look at the next guy, Hollywood Brown. And Hollywood Brown coming over to Kansas City by way of Arizona this past season. Last season, he had 51 receptions, 101 targets, 574 yards, and 4 touchdowns. Thoughts on Hollywood Brown?
I think the potential to be very good and very dynamic is there anytime you're playing with Patrick Mahomes. But I think not understanding what that defined role is going to be is going to cause me to shy away from Hollywood a little bit more. And maybe I would, go for that DeAndre Hopkins pick or wait the full round later and go Deontay where I know he's the number one guy and going to get peppered with targets in a contract year. Hopkins had some great moments with Kyler Murray, had some great moments with and without DeAndre Hopkins in Arizona, but also had some real bummers, right? Definitely, he got injured, and so it kind of screwed up the back end of his season. But his last 2 games where he played for Arizona, 3 targets, 0 catches over 2 games. Like, again, it's what have you done for me lately? I know Arizona was in a little bit different space there, but Kyler was back by then, right? Like we expected Hollywood to kind of take this step and to get, kind of emerge there as Kyler would help elevate him from a subpar season, right? Did not finish and did not go the way we wanted to, and it just never happened. Was clearly disgruntled. That's why they're willing to let him go. And again, Xavier Worthy, Brown might be one of those guys at the beginning of the season. Maybe he pops a little bit without Rashee Rice. And then as Rice comes back, maybe you see Brown go down the list a little bit because Brown and Worthy have a very similar skill set. And so that it gives me cause for concern at least a little bit. And I'm just not sure where I see the guaranteed path to targets. And that he doesn't fall into kind of the Juju Smith-Schuster route. Maybe a little bit more dependable than what Juju was, but nevertheless, like it's just not a guy that in this, wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 territory. I'm not convinced that he's necessarily going to easily return that. Like he might have a couple monster weeks to help get him there if he's able to get behind the defense. But I also think he's going to have some weeks that kind of leave you scratching your head a little bit. And not that I'm unwilling to take that challenge, but I think that challenge for me is probably a little bit more suited to best ball than it is for redraft.
Mhm.
So as it sits right now, I think I would pass on Hollywood Brown and look elsewhere on this list. And really Hopkins, Johnson, or Jordan Addison. I think I like all three of those a little bit more than I like Hollywood Brown.
Fair enough. I can certainly see that point there. And Hollywood Brown is a guy that's, you know, I think you hit the nail right on the head, right? When you're talking best ball format, like that's where I'm really looking to try and get me some Hollywood is in that best ball format, because he will have some big blow up weeks, and he'll also have some weeks where he kind of fades down there and really kind of lets you down throughout a couple of those weeks. So yeah, this is one of those that the offensive situation looks good. There's reports coming out, Andy Reid coming out saying that Hollywood and Mahomes are building some chemistry there, and kind of all of those things pointing in a good sense and all of that. But again, this is one of those that the Chiefs, outside of Travis Kelce, are not necessarily going to force the ball into any other receiving option there. And so that's one of those that it wouldn't surprise me if you see some big blow up weeks and some fading weeks. And I think there's some other options that you could go with that you can probably get a little bit more steady floor with that. And Hollywood, even if we see him kind of go through and put up some good week, consistent weeks there, the ceiling on this is probably wide receiver 22, 23 when it's all said and done. So there's not a tremendous upside that I'd be looking to go with here with some of these other guys kind of in and around this that I could potentially go, and there's a higher chance that I probably see a return in the teens on a wide receiver finish. So painful to say, but there are probably some other options I'd be looking for in this route. Any other thoughts on Hollywood?
No, sir.
All right, let's go ahead and hit up Calvin Ridley. And Calvin Ridley coming over to the Tennessee Titans from Jacksonville this last season. 76 receptions, 136 targets, 1,016 yards, and 8 touchdowns. Thoughts on Calvin Ridley?
So Ridley had a pretty strong season, right? All things considered, coming back after basically little over a season and a half hiatus between the mental breakdown, the suspension for gambling, leaving Atlanta, coming into, and then being traded to Jacksonville, or being picked up by Jacksonville, excuse me. Overall, not bad. Like you said, 136 targets. That was pretty good there in Jacksonville. So his time there was relatively short-lived, and now he's up to Tennessee. I think pairing him with DeAndre Hopkins is awesome. Like, I think that does really good things for both of those guys. And again, Will Levis is a gunslinger, right? Like, he does want to throw the rock. This Tennessee offense is going to be leaning on the pass much more than what we've kind of grown accustomed to in the Ryan Tannehill, Derrick Henry era that is now over in Tennessee. So, I think with where Calvin Ridley is going, my gut tells me that that's kind of the floor for him there in Tennessee. Like, I do feel like he outperforms this ADP. It's just a matter of how much farther we think he crawls up this list, right? So we do think Hopkins is going to have a big year. I think Ridley could have a big year as well. And you could see both those guys finish inside the top 24.
Yeah.
So I think there's a path for that, which again, there's value there. So if you don't want to load up on Tennessee players, for me, I would wait and go Hopkins, because I feel like their numbers would be relatively similar, and I get basically a full round discount on DeAndre Hopkins. So, that's where I would draw the line there, but I'm definitely not opposed to Calvin Ridley. There is a clear path to targets, and production in Tennessee with the way this offense is going to go. So, picking him up at 66 overall, may not be how I draw out my draft board, if that makes sense, but I'm not going to shy away from it, especially if I feel like, I didn't get a receiver that I wanted, or maybe a guy that I was targeting in the first couple of rounds. This would be a way to kind of stop the bleeding and make sure that I get points.
Right. I could certainly see that. And Calvin Ridley's a guy that, which we just mentioned that in this range, right? Like, the guy that could give you a wide receiver finish in the teens. Calvin Ridley's a guy that you could be drafting here in kind of the fifth round, that fifth or sixth round in most cases, where you could receive, like, you could see a finish up there in your fringe wide receiver one territory, right? There certainly is the opportunity for that one there, right? Like, the talent is there. And we've seen him play extremely well when he's not necessarily the clear-cut defined number one receiving option for a team, right? Like, the best season came when he was considered the wide receiver 2 for Atlanta, playing opposite of Julio Jones. And we could see some of that play out here as well, with the pairing of him and DeAndre Hopkins. Now, one of the things that does kind of concern me there is with Calvin Ridley, you're not necessarily going to get that week in, week out, set it and forget it, and I'm gonna be able to just kind of rock that one out as my wide receiver 2 or my wide receiver 3 in some scenarios. There's going to be some fluctuations in there, and same thing with last year, right? There were some weeks that he went out there and absolutely balled out, won you a week, and the following week, finished in a position that was almost unusable, and it may have lost you the week when it was all said and done there. So some of that could be the scheme, some of that could be how they were using him down there in Jacksonville, and we may see some potential differences with that. But this is a guy that certainly can pop and can have some really good finishes over the course of the season. It may not be as smooth as you may like it, though, when it all comes down to it. Any other thoughts on Calvin Ridley?
Only that part of the reason Tennessee might have picked him up is because he did torch him both games last year. So in two games versus Tennessee, he had 19 targets for 13 receptions, 209 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Like, he did, and it was evenly spread apart. His games were almost identical against Tennessee. So they definitely saw some things on tape with Calvin Ridley and getting burned by him. That part of him is, if you can't beat him, join him. In their case, but part of it is wanting to surround Will Levis with talent. But there's a path, right? And sometimes that's all we need.
Right. It's very true. Before we get into our next guy, I did see the comment come in here from Terry. And Terry, my apologies, I didn't see it before, but Terry asking the question of which side do you prefer in a half-point PPR, Kupp and Ford or Pittman and B-Rob? And I'm going to assume that's Brian Robinson, not Bijan Robinson.
I'm going to assume that as well. So I'm going to tell you Pittman and Brian Robinson. Only because there's no guarantee that Ford is actually going to be the starter in Cleveland all season long. When Nick Chubb is healthy, they're going to give him touches. Now, how he performs remains to be seen, right? I selfishly want Nick Chubb to just come out of the gates and look like nothing ever happened, because he is one of my favorite football players. So I love rooting for Nick Chubb. So it's nothing against Ford. But he's not going to see the volume going down the stretch that I think you would like to see. Brian Robinson is going to be a little bit more consistent there in Washington. And Kupp versus Pittman, Kupp probably has a higher ceiling, but Pittman definitely has a safer floor. He's the clear number one in Indianapolis. That offense may not pass as much, but he has been a very consistent guy that you can bank on as a solid wide receiver 2, with some wide receiver 1 upside, he's going to see 8 to 12 targets a week basically guaranteed, and it didn't really matter who the quarterback was last year, and I don't think that's going to change this year. So for me, there's a little bit more safety in Pittman and B-Rob. But if you're looking for a big splash, Cup's healthy, Stafford's healthy. You got Puka on the other side, so that way they can't just focus in on Cup. And now Cooper Cup, rewind 5 years. And when it was Cooper Cup and Robert Woods, right? And the emergence of Cooper Cup, what that did for Robert Woods before he left the Rams, that's kind of what Puka's doing, right? The emergence of Puka is going to allow Cup to continue to do what he does really well. Very shifty, clean route runner, gets in the end zone quite often. So Cup does have the higher upside. But I think the injury history, not only with the quarterback, but with Cup himself, the fact that the offensive line still has plenty of questions, and the fact that Ford, there's no guarantee that Ford's going to be your starter, even 13 weeks of the regular season, makes me pivot towards Pittman and Robinson.
Yeah. I was leaning towards Cup and Ford when I first saw this question come through, but you've talked me into the Pittman and B-Rob side. So I concur. Alrighty. Let's go ahead and hit up the next guy here, Jaden Reed. And Jaden Reed, in his rookie season last year, 64 receptions, 94 targets, 793 yards, and 8 touchdowns. Thoughts on Jaden Reed?
I like Jaden Reed. If he's a guy, I like Jaden Reed even more. If you're in a league that you get points for return yardage, he returned 11 punts last year for 94 yards for the Packers, so he's going to get involved in that. Really was able to be used all over the field, right? They used him in the passing game. They did use him in the run game a little bit. I think my problem personally is I like Dobbs and Watson so much. I just don't know if you're going to get everybody fed in Green Bay on top of Josh Jacobs. And so Jaden Reed, because of where his value is probably the Packer that I'm least excited about, because I feel like I can get a similar return at a lesser draft stock or a lesser draft value, which to me returns greater fantasy value, if that makes sense, the way I'm sharing that, right? But I like Reed. I like what he's able to do. I think that he had a very good year. 8 touchdowns might be a little tough, especially if Watson is really healthy all season long. But we've said before on the show, like, we think Love's taken a step forward. I think Christian Watson's going to have a monster year this year. Dobbs is going to continue to do his thing, and was really probably the most consistent wide receiver. Reed had some bigger weeks, but Dobbs week in and week out was probably a little bit more consistent. And again, it's when you're looking at Jaden Reed, 64 overall compared to being able to draft Watson and Dobbs in the 90s, like that's real, right? You're talking 30 picks discounts, another 2.5, 3 rounds worth of a discount of guys that I think are going to finish in the same range as Jaden Reed. So even if it's just 1 or 2 spots behind, because of where I was able to draft them, to me, that's a greater return.
Yeah. Jaden Reed is probably the Packer wide receiver that I'm least likely to draft this season. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that he's coming off the board in a late 5th, early 6th type of draft capital there. And there's other guys that I'd rather go with. Chris Godwin's going very similar in that range. Calvin Ridley's going very similar in that range. I would rather go either one of those guys over Jaden Reed and kind of skip on this one and take some of those Packers that you mentioned a little bit later on. Take my shot on Christian Watson, take my shot on Romeo Dobbs, and probably see very similar returns on that. Jaden Reed definitely was utilized a little bit more throughout the offense there, but I don't know that we see him get as much rushing work this coming season was what we saw this last season, and that the 100 rushing yards, the 2 touchdowns on the ground there certainly helped out with the boosting him into wide receiver 2 territory for last season's finish. But when it was all said and done, like Jaden Reed didn't get there because of outstanding receiving numbers, didn't get there due to the receptions, was very much touchdown dependent, and when you put up 10 total touchdowns at the wide receiver position, that's where that's going to lie there. So I think that there's some regression coming here, and there's other Packers wide receivers I'd rather go with. Any other thoughts on Jaden Reed?
Nah, cosign.
All right. So Terry had another question for us. Thoughts on this trade offer? Trade away JT and DK to acquire AJ Brown, Mostert, and Purdy. His current QB is the Tua.
I guess I don't hate it, right? I mean, AJ Brown is greater than DK Metcalf.
Right.
So Mostert, I'm kind of thinking of Mostert as like a 1-year rental. Works great in a redraft league, but if this is dynasty, doesn't really do anything for you. But I do like Purdy. Like, and I think Purdy and Tua combined gives you a nice kind of a nice 1-2 punch there at quarterback. So if you feel like you are covered, Terry, at the running back position with losing Jonathan Taylor, I see nothing wrong with this deal. Like, it
You
is
said
a
it's
redraft.
redraft.
So I don't hate the deal. I'd tell you that AJ Brown. Who's your other running backs, buddy? I know you're watching this. If you can throw that in the chat for me here real quick, this might help tilt me to one conclusive decision over the other.
Yeah, I mean this one's close. They're very close on that, and some of that. What that other running back's going to do is going to, potentially lean that way. But I think you're right. I think even with Mostert potentially being a 1-year rental, like at that point, I don't think that we're going to see the Mostert that we saw last year, even at that point. So,
Talk about because of health or just overall production?
overall production, right? Like I think that we see him utilized there, but not necessarily in the same vein that we saw last year. And so there is some of that I'd be a little bit leery about getting that if my running back situation wasn't rock solid. Currently says his running backs are Gibbs, Achane, JT, Swift, Monty, and Singletary. Okay, I'd do the deal.
See, and I wouldn't. I don't want 2 handcuffs
Fair
in one
enough.
position group.
Fair enough.
And I'd rather have Gibbs. I think I'd rather have Gibbs and Monty than Achane and Montgomery. Or I think I'd rather have Gibbs and Monty over Achane and Mostert. Redraft league, Tua will get you there for most of the season, right? Like you might have to end up figuring something else out for a week or two, but I think with it being a redraft, the way looks tells me it's a 10 team league. Is this Terry? Is this right? I'm guessing it's a 10 team league with being able to get JT, Gibbs, and AJ Brown, or excuse me, and DK. I can see how this falls in.
Yeah.
I don't think I do this. I think I let JT go and ride with him and DK with this
Okay.
being the case. Because and again, there'll be quarterbacks out there in a 10-team league. If Tua starts to falter, I expect Tyreek to still have a good year. I think Waddle's going to have a really solid year for you. McDaniels does a good job with that offense, getting things creative. There's going to be pain at times with Tua. So I think, you look at who you could pick up off the waiver wire. It's kind of a streaming backup to be able to help you there. But I don't want the Lions and the Dolphins running back rooms on my roster. It leads to too much indecisiveness if one guy pops one week and then you're trying to decide who you're going to start, who you're not going to start. And I don't know that you need that headache.
Fair enough. All righty. Let's go ahead and head on over to our next guy, and that is Chris Godwin. And Chris Godwin last season had 83 receptions on 130 targets, 1,024 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Thoughts on Chris Godwin?
I think we are going to see some positive regression back in the touchdown market here for Godwin. But I think the targets remain about the same, about 130 targets, something like that, with the way that this Tampa Bay offense is shaken out. He's consistently hit 1,000 yards each of the last 3 seasons. So, I think 31's probably the floor. You're getting him right at where he was last year. So I think you're getting him at his floor. So I do like that. And again, I think he probably falls into the end zone maybe a little bit more here, have his receptions tick up a little bit, if nothing else. And so I think that sneaks you from that 31, 32 range and gets you up to, at least 27, 26, falls into the end zone 2 or 3 more times, even to get you 5. Now you're back up into 18 territory, maybe 17 territory. Again, clear path for Godwin to outperform this. So I like Chris Godwin this year as kind of that sneaky play, but he's very consistent, right? Looking at what he was doing with Tampa Bay last year. He had 1 down game against Houston, where he went 6 targets, 2 catches for 16 yards, right? That one was not very stout, but really his numbers were very good for a wide receiver 2 on a team that's going to throw the ball quite a bit. He was just missing the touchdowns, and I think he sees that come back to him a little bit this year.
Yeah, I could certainly see some positive regression in the touchdown category. One of the things that I'm really liking is some of the reports coming out of kind of Buccaneers camp and how you're kind of planning on utilizing him more so. And honestly, I thought we'd see him utilized more so in the slot last year and be kind of Baker's number 1 target through over there, but was definitely kind of played on the outside a little bit more. We saw saw some other guys get the snaps more so at the slot, but it does sound like the plan is to kind of move Godwin a little bit more into the slot this year, which I think is going to absolutely help him, and we'll see him outperform this. And so again, one of those that you're getting the guy at a floor kind of play here. I don't know that we'll necessarily see him drastically outperform this, but it wouldn't surprise me to see him sneak into back end wide receiver 2 when the season's all said and done. And I think that you'll be very happy with the consistency of which you'll be able to do that. So, there's a lot to be said about, taking a guy with kind of 62nd overall that can be your wide receiver 2 on a week in, week out type of basis there. And so I think that I really like Chris Godwin this season when it's all said and done. Any other thoughts on Chris Godwin?
No, cosign, man. You're getting him basically a 2-round discount is what I think of Chris Godwin right now.
Absolutely. All right, let's go ahead and hit up the next guy here, Terry McLaurin. And Terry McLaurin last season had 79 receptions on 132 targets, 1,002 yards, and 4 touchdowns. Thoughts on Terry McLaurin?
So Terry, for the course of his career, has lived in this wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 fringe territory. So because of that, I'd tell you that he's going a little low. Like, I think this would absolutely be his floor. Wide receiver 32 would be his worst finish in his career. Yes, they're getting a new quarterback in there, but I think it's also new life in Washington here a little bit. So, I like Terry more this year than I have in years past. I have been a big, I don't want to say hater, but I have been very opposed to Terry McLaurin with where he was being drafted, because he was consistently going in the teens and not making it to basically his draft capital. Now, I think the switch has flipped all the way to the other side. Now I think he's undervalued. So this is why I like Terry McLaurin. Um, another guy, I think him and Chris Godwin could have eerily similar stats when it's all said and done with. And the good thing is, in Washington, he's kind of clearly the alpha in Washington, where Chris Godwin is obviously going with Mike Evans and an offense that will, probably be a little bit more balanced than what I think Washington's going to end up being. So I like Terry McLaurin. And Chris Godwin both. They're back-to-back picks, basically, going right next to each other. So I like that as well. So if the guy in front of me happens to take one, same tiers, right? We'll get into this as we get a little bit closer to draft time, but same tiers for me. So I like the idea to be able to pivot from one to the other. So my stamp of approval for Terry McLaurin this year. I think you have some built-in value with where his draft stock is currently.
Yeah, I would agree with that, right? Like he is kind of consistently in that, back end wide receiver 2 at the most, most seasons when they finish up there. And what you're going to get out of Terry McLaurin is very much in that 130 target range, right around 80 receptions, right around 1,000 to 1,100 yards and 4 to 5 touchdowns, right? Like that's where you can kind of almost pencil him in at. And I think that we're going to see something very similar to that again this year. So I do think that you're right with the fact that there's some baked in value here when it's all said and done. And it probably worst case, you're drafting him at the floor there. So there's certainly some value here. I'm hoping that with the quarterback changeover, we can see a little bit of some new life here with a Washington offense. Jaden Daniels was a guy that we saw kind of air that out last year in at LSU and definitely be able to hit some of those downfield throws and really hit those on time, on target. And Terry McLaurin's a guy that we tend to see his average reception be in that 13 to 15 yards down the field there. So I think that there's some benefit there to having Jaden Daniels coming to town and throwing the ball, and I do think that there is some value here as well. So any other thoughts on Terry McLaurin?
Nope.
All righty. Let's go ahead and hit up Christian Kirk. And Christian Kirk last season was 57 receptions on 85 targets, 787 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Thoughts on Christian Kirk?
So Kirk was injured at the tail end of last season, and he did all this in 12 recorded games. Realistically, it was 11. He played 1 snap, caught 1 catch on 1 target for 26 yards. It was the first play of the game. That he got hurt against Cincinnati in week 13, and then he was out the rest of the year. So Christian Kirk has been highly, highly useful. Trevor Lawrence leans on him very often. I think that will continue going into this season. So I think Kirk is another guy who is being undervalued. And I think that the path for Christian Kirk to really get up into the mid wide receiver 2 territory is extremely plausible with what they're going to need to do in Jacksonville this year to be successful. So I like Christian Kirk a lot. I think he has a little bit higher upside than maybe Terry McLaurin or Chris Godwin. He's going right there at the same range. Kirk, McLaurin, Godwin, and Reed, Ridley, and Brown, right? They're all going right there at that. I mean, 50. This is 58 through 66. Like all these picks are right together. So clearly the fantasy industry, sees this as a wide receiver pocket worth drafting. I am comfortable with most of these guys. But if I'm first in line, I'll start the run with Kirk because I do think he probably has the highest upside out of all these guys just based off the volume share that he'll see in that offense. Because again, he was on pace to match his 2022 numbers where he finished as wide receiver 11, wide receiver 12, maybe a little bit less if the touchdowns didn't tick up just a little bit faster. But I think we're going to see something very similar where we could see him finish, inside inside wide receiver, 15, 16, maybe a little bit higher. So for that reason, Kirk's going to be top of my list for this little group of receivers here, but I like him a lot.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of really good things that Christian Kirk kind of brings to the table here when you're talking for your fantasy roster. When it's all said and done, wouldn't surprise me to see him, be in that fringe wide receiver 1 territory when the season's all said and done there, right? Like he goes out there and he does earn a lot of targets in this offense. Typically is kind of in that 20, 21, 22, 23% target share, kind of range there. And even when and not only does he earn the targets, but he also is very consistent with how he goes out there and does it, right? Like he's typically in that 11, 12, 13 points per game type of thing when it goes through. So you get a lot of consistent games, and then you have a couple of blow up games on top of that as well. So at worst case scenario, you're drafting a guy here in the 5th round that can easily be your flex position type of deal, and can be a very reliable flex position with giving you the upside of being able to finish in wide receiver 1, potential, wide receiver 2 territory when the season's all said and done. So this is a guy that you put on your roster as your 3rd, potentially 4th wide receiver, depending upon how your draft is going. Get a week in, week out flex play option with wide receiver 2, potentially even wide receiver 1 upside here. So lots of things to like about that. And I do like that thought about, kind of with all of these guys going kind of right together and how that grouping is going, that it, certainly wouldn't hurt to start the run with a Christian Kirk here. Any other thoughts on Christian Kirk?
No, sir. Sounds like we're aligned.
All righty. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next guy here, T. Higgins. And T. Higgins last season, 42 receptions, 76 targets, 656 yards, and 5 touchdowns. Thoughts on T. Higgins?
T. Higgins. I want to like T. Higgins because I felt like, not that I was alone, but I was one of the few guys kind of touting T. Higgins as a rookie and being able to do that. And we've had some pretty successful years. Last year, not as much, right? Missed 5 games, 6 games, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, excuse me, 5 games. Yeah, so missed 5 games. Sand is franchise tender, so that's good, right? So that's not a distraction anymore. He's on a contract year to get paid. So I think there's a lot of things pointing in his direction of why he could have a very big season. I think the thing that's holding T. Higgins back is he plays on a team with Jamar Chase. So now again, I'd tell you 30, probably a bit low. Like last year being injured, everything else, but I do think he's on a mission to prove some things this year. So I think you're getting a decent discount here at T. Higgins. I'm not surprised or won't be surprised to see him inside the top 24 and possibly well inside the top 24 when it's all said and done with. So another guy kind of going where I like this value. Given the choice, though, I'm probably going to go Kirk over Higgins. Being the number 1 in Jacksonville, to me, is just slightly better than being the number 2 in Cincinnati. So I'll probably go Kirk over Higgins. But I'm also, if he does slide in the home league, I'll pick him up and put him on my roster. Like I'm not afraid to do that if I feel like he slides much further than this because I like Higgins. I like his upside over Terry McLaurin and Chris Godwin just a little bit. I like his upside in what he can do over Jaden Reed, just because there's a few less mouths to feed in Cincinnati than there is in Green Bay. So, he's well in this range. Like this is where he's going to go in most cases. But if he happens to slide, snatch him up because the upside is real.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those too that some of the reports kind of coming out there. It sounds too like Joe Burrow even has a little bit of a chip on his shoulder about going out and trying to prove something this season as well. So you got the quarterback that seems like he's on a mission to go out there and do it. You've got the T. Higgins out there in a contract year on a bit of a discount. Like there's a lot of things to like on this one. Not only that, T Higgins is definitely a downfield threat. When you look at it, he has several 14 receptions of more than 20 plus yards, right? Like there's a lot of those downfield throws that go to T Higgins here as well. And when it's all said and done, I think we're going to see him probably somewhere around about 70 receptions. You call it somewhere around probably about 1,000 to 1,050 yards and somewhere around 7-8 touchdowns, which that would likely put him in the range of being wide receiver 17 through 20 when it's all said and done on the season, right? Firmly inside wide receiver 2 territory. So again, I think you're getting a very good discount on this one. There's some good upside here. I do like some of the points that you made about some of these other guys potentially having a little bit more upside, but T Higgins is a guy that I think will you're certainly getting a good discount and there's a lot of value there. The only thing that kind of concerns me there a little bit is the strength of schedule during the season is a little bit rough. Like the Bengals have one of the harder schedules, for wide receivers as they're ranked there. And some of that has to do with just the divisional play, right? There's a lot of good defenses in that AFC North. And that could limit there a little bit, but again, this is one of those, we'll see some very boom bust weeks out of T Higgins. And when it's all said and done, I think we'll see him well inside a wide receiver 2. Any other thoughts on T Higgins?
No, sir.
All righty. Let's go ahead and take a look here at Tank Dell. And Tank Dell in his rookie season last year, 47 receptions, 75 targets, 709 yards and 7 touchdowns. Thoughts on Tank Dell?
Tank Dell, I think with bringing in Stephon Diggs, the emergence of Nico Collins, I think Tank Dell at the moment's the odd man out. I think he could get to wide receiver 29, but I think it's more likely that he comes in below, like his final ranking will be below his draft position, than it is that he will come in above on the final rankings where his draft position is. So, call it a bust if you will. I'm just not high on him at this draft spot, right? Like there's a price for everybody. So I'm not saying that I'm taking him off my board, but I'm not paying a top 30 pick for Tank Dell. Like not going to happen. I will pass over Tank Dell. I will go Higgins. I will go Kirk. Probably McLaurin, Godwin, even Jaden Reed, like all these guys that we just talked about, I like more than Tank Dell. I think Tank Dell and Rashee Rice both need to be dropped outside of the top 40. And Dell just outside the top 40. And then I'm interested big time in Tank Dell. But I do think that 29, way too rich for my blood, given the fact that he's been injured, the gunshot wound, like all the things that are going on in Houston with the new mouths to feed. So I just got to be an odd man out somewhere, and Tank Dell's for me is that guy. Like he's going to be the odd man out. They'll find ways to get him involved for sure, but I don't think you're going to see the 10 targets, 8 catches, 149 yards and a touchdown like you saw in week 11 against Arizona. I don't think you're going to see that this season.
Yeah, I think it'll certainly be tough to see those types of performances and see that kind of come to fruition again. He's coming off the injury. And that was a nasty injury that we saw there. But he certainly had a lot of things kind of going, and when it looks at some of the metrics there, as far as very comparable with a lot of numbers that Nico Collins was putting up there, as far as kind of the air the target share, some of the air yard shares, some of the just kind of the overall opportunities and some of the fantasy points per game when it was being said there. But that's also going to change, right? Like they went out, they acquired Stephon Diggs to bring him in. And so now you're going to see Stephon Diggs, Nico Collins as really kind of the 1-2 punch there. You may see Tank Dell, a little bit utilized in the slot there as well, but this is not one of those that I'm I'm going out to actively try and put him on my roster. This is one of those that's probably in a next season maybe a different story, but this season right here is one that I'm going to have a hard time. If I'm staring down the draft board and I'm looking at Tank Dell or T Higgins or Tank Dell, Christian Kirk, or like there's several guys like you just listed that are going after him that I would pull the trigger on. More so than go and Tank Dell. So I think we are seeing a little bit of some overdrafting happen with Tank. Any other thoughts here?
Negative, Ghost Rider.
All right, let's take a look at George Pickens. And George Pickens last year, 63 receptions, 106 targets, 1,140 yards, and 5 touchdowns. Thoughts on George Pickens?
I could see this kind of being where Pickens ends up, right? Like, I don't expect Pittsburgh to be uber dynamic in the passing game. And I expect them to try and find ways to incorporate Justin Fields in the red zone. Now, all that being said, there's not a whole lot of wide receivers to throw the ball to in Pittsburgh. So I do expect the targets to remain super elevated. Russell's going to be more accurate than Kenny Pickett. So there are things that you can talk yourself into, right? There's a path to be inside the top 20 for George Pickens. There's just a clear path. The talent is there. The amazing catches are there. But as much as it pains me to say this, he can be a little prima donna-y, right? He can throw a little fit if he's not involved in the offense in the way he wants to. I think Russ will be able to help with that. He's not going to be able to bully Russ around like he did Kenny Pickett. And Mike McCarthy knows how to handle different personas, if you will. So
You mean Mike Tomlin?
Yes, sorry, Mike Tomlin.
Okay.
Who did I say?
McCarthy.
Oh, no, Mike Tomlin. Excuse me. Sorry. So I don't know that I love Pickens just in this 50 range, right? Like, I just feel like I'm looking in other directions. I don't have a whole lot of George Pickens on my rosters. It's just not quite fallen to me that way. So he's not actively being sucked up everywhere I can and put on a roster. I think there's a right place for all of it. But again, I think I would pass on George Pickens and go Christian Kirk. Like, I'd rather overdraft Christian Kirk and go that route and let the George Pickens, really Pittsburgh saga, kind of go as someone else. Like, Pittsburgh's just an offense that I'm not super high on. I don't want to have a lot of Pittsburgh pieces on my fantasy roster. That just doesn't spell fantasy success for me this season. So I like the guy a lot. I do. And I think he's a highlight reel waiting to happen. But I just think with where he's going on draft boards, he's not landing on many of my rosters this season.
Yeah, I concur. Right, like this is one of those that we are back into an Arthur Smith offense here that we just saw what that looked like the last few years in Atlanta. Right, I'm not necessarily convinced that we're going to see a whole lot of really good passing attack and passing game here. So I hope that I'm wrong, but there's reports coming out that they're planning on trying to work George Pickens in the slot as well as being out on the outside there as well, and that could potentially allow him to kind of open up and see some additional looks there. But this is one that with some of the what I think is going to be some quarterback drama in Pittsburgh later this season. With the nature of an Arthur Smith run all the time offense, and maybe we'll throw the ball down the field and what that looks like. I'm just not necessarily getting into this one. And again, there's other guys I'd rather go with here than that. So George Pickens, a guy that will not be on many of my rosters when it's all said and done. Any other thoughts on George Pickens?
No, sir.
All right, let's go ahead and take a look at Keenan Allen. And actually, before we get to that one, we did have a question come in here. Ryan over on YouTube asking, would you send Josh Jacobs for Corum and a 2025 first if you were a Kyron manager? So, Kyron
Assuming
Williams.
this is a dynasty league.
Yep, that's the way I'm taking that as well.
So being on the clock with Corum right in front of me, knowing I'm a Kyron owner, would I trade away Josh Jacobs or right in front of my opponent? Would I trade away Josh Jacobs for a 3rd-round pick in this year's rookie draft and a 1st-round pick in next year's rookie draft? I definitely get the allure to this, right? And I definitely understand, Ryan, why you have this question, because it's making me think. It really is making me think. I
For me, I honestly think it would depend a little bit. And granted, right, like you don't know for certain at this point on where that first would be, but if it's a back end 2025 first, I literally I don't know that you're returning enough value there. So some of that depends on where that would be and where you'd be projected. If it's an early to mid, that may sway me there. But I kind of like running it back this season with the 1-2 punch of Kyron Williams and Josh Jacobs in my backfield.
if I'm trying to win this season, absolutely. And I'm just gonna bank on the fact that hope that Kyron stays healthy. If I'm competitive, but I'm not quite there, then yeah, I want to acquire an asset for, Jacobs is a good piece, right? Good piece. Going into Green Bay, which again, good spot. I think it's gonna be a really good spot for him. Aaron Jones did well there for years. And then this 25 first. I think I'm with Derek. I don't think I do the deal, but I'm definitely going to spend a lot of time thinking about it before I just decline or counter, right? I mean, maybe it's one of those things that if you give up Jacobs for Corum, maybe you don't want the first. Like, see if you can find a solid wide receiver 2, like any one of these guys that we just talked about.
Right.
To
Or
kind of add to that mix and see if that does it for you. Because Jacobs is going in this round too, also, right? Yes, going in this round also. That a lot of these guys that we're talking about. So I wouldn't be opposed to seeing if you could get something like a Calvin Ridley, right? Someone who's mid to late 20s, kind of a wide receiver 2 territory. You can't go too young, right? I wouldn't go Jaden Reed, that type. I think that's a little bit too young. You're not going to get out of it. You're probably not going to get that trade accepted.
Chris Godwin wouldn't be a bad
Godwin
target.
wouldn't be bad, and I wouldn't go as old as Keenan Allen.
Right.
So, somewhere, or DeAndre Hopkins. I wouldn't go that old either if it were a dynasty league. So, I think we've listed through enough of these guys here that he might be able to take a shot on that. Take a stab at Rashee Rice. Maybe they don't want to deal with the suspension. Deontay's a little interesting, right? If we go further down the list, back to the beginning of the show, I think Deontay's a little interesting. The upside for Deontay is there. So yeah, I as is, I don't think I do the deal, but more often than not, I would rather acquire a known asset, in kind of the middle of his career, even if it's at the middle end of his career, than I would a random 25 or 2025 first round pick where I don't know who all's declaring and I don't know what this pick is going to actually end up being, because you could get stuck in kind of no man's land, if you will, and really not like what you're saddled with.
Right. I mean, that'd be like if you got like the 109, 110, 111 type of pick in this year's draft, and you had that kind of caliber player fall into you, where you've got some high upside, but there's still developmental type of deal there. No thanks. Like uh so yeah, I'm with Kevin where I would try and acquire a known asset at that point, and potentially try and get a little bit somebody that I know what I'm kind of getting there. If you're really trying to go with the draft picks because you're more of a on a rebuild side of things, yeah, at that point, see if you can't acquire some additional future capital in there, right? Like, so take the 2025, but then also start, counter back with some 2026 type of capital, second or third on top of that type of thing. Like, there's there's a deal to be had there, but I don't know that the deal that's presented is the one to take. Any other thoughts on that one?
Nah.
All right. Let's go ahead and hit up Keenan Allen. And Keenan Allen last year had 108 receptions, 150 targets, 1,243 yards, and 7 touchdowns. Thoughts on Keenan Allen?
Keenan Allen, 32 years old, moving into a new offense, rookie quarterback. I'm interested to see how this is going, right? I mean, they drafted a Dunze. They have DJ Moore, Keenan Allen's obviously there. DeAndre Swift is coming in there. Caleb Williams as a rookie. Uh, I think this season is the season I'm staying away from Keenan Allen. Like, he had a heck of a run here for us, really for the better part of the last 8 years. But for me, I think this run stops. The potential is there to be, inside wide receiver 15, but the likelihood for that potential, I think, is lacking. So I think I'd rather pivot, um, maybe go a different position group altogether, or if I'm kind of set on wide receiver at this spot, again, looking at a T. Higgins or Christian Kirk, as opposed to a Keenan Allen, just banking on the fact that your quarterback competency is going to be enough to help you win the day there.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot to be said about the rookie QB side of things, and this is one of those. Keenan Allen coming off of arguably his career year, right? Like, there's a lot of things that were to like there, but again, new offense, new system here, a lot of competition in this one as well. Like, I think you're right. I think there's some other guys down the list that maybe make a little bit more sense to go with here, which is kind of painful to say, and wish that wasn't kind of what I'm seeing here. But I'd be looking other directions there as well. Any other thoughts on Keenan Allen? All right. Let's go ahead and hit up Zay Flowers. And Zay Flowers last season, 77 receptions, 108 targets, 858 yards, and 5 touchdowns. Thoughts on Zay Flowers?
Oh man, good rookie year for Zay Flowers, right? Really kind of emerged there and he's a good focal point there for the passing game in Baltimore. I think that with Zay, you're still going to see some bust weeks. And for a guy that's right there at fringe wide receiver 2 territory, I think that's to be acknowledged and to be had. It's really just trying to understand where this is. So 108 targets last year. I could see that tick up to 120-ish this year, maybe 82, 83 receptions. We'll call that enough to get him to 900 yards and 6 touchdowns, right? I mean, if there's that, the 5 number honestly kind of seems pretty nice. So I don't know that I would bank on more touchdowns. So I don't hate the pick. I think you're getting good, adequate value for what that pick is, but I think that's exactly what Zay Flower is. So there's not necessarily value built in, and that's okay. You can't have that with every draft pick, right? Like, you can't build an entire roster based off of value, potential, and upside. I think this is possibly one of those cases there at 46. If you really don't like the running backs that are around, or you feel like, um, you don't want to gamble on waiting to see what comes back to you on receiver for the next round, Zay Flowers is your, you know, second or third wide receiver at this point. I think I can live with that, but I don't want this as my first wide receiver if I decide to go, running back, tight end, or something like that.
Yeah, I'd agree. Right, the Zay Flowers, really, really didn't quite have there was a lot of hype around Zay Flowers coming into this offense and what it could look like and all of that leading up to last year. And while he definitely delivered a good rookie season, what didn't quite necessarily live up to the hype on this one as well. Now, there's a lot of things that are positive around this one, and we could see, right, like Zay Flowers and Mark Andrews will be, target 1, target 2 on this offense there. When it's all said and done, I think we see Zay Flowers somewhere around probably 80 receptions, probably really close to about 1,000 yards when it's all said and done, and probably somewhere in that 6, maybe 7 touchdown range. So, all of that to be said, like that's going to be kind of in that back end wide receiver 2, fringe wide receiver 2 type of numbers, and that's kind of what you're drafting there, right? Like you're very much kind of drafting what you're getting as far as how I kind of see that, where there's not a lot of upside, but it's probably a pretty safe built-in floor with that as well. So, any other thoughts on Zay Flowers? Alrighty, and Amari Cooper is the next guy up here, and Amari Cooper last season 72 receptions, 128 targets, 1,250 yards, and 5 touchdowns. Thoughts on Amari Cooper?
Coop, again, kind of a revolving door at quarterback that the Browns had there for a little bit. But I mean, Coop's numbers in large part are bolstered by 2 really big games, right? Week 16 against Houston, where he went 11 of 15 for 265 yards and 2 touchdowns. 47.5 fantasy points basically, and half point PPR, like monster week. Great for the playoffs, but it does kind of pervert these stats a little bit. And then again in week number 9, where he went 5 for 5 for 139 and a touchdown. It's kind of a high water mark. After that, he starts to fall out of this wide receiver 2 territory and becomes a fringe wide receiver 2. So being drafted at 25, I'd tell you you're getting adequate value for Amari Cooper. You could see him sneak up there a little bit. You could possibly see him fall down just below that a little bit. But this is a pretty safe pick at wide receiver 25, coming off the board at 45, 46, 47 overall. So I don't hate this, but much like Zay Flowers, I think you're going to have a couple monster weeks. And then you're just going to have some ho-hum weeks because, again, Cleveland wants to run the ball. They want to run the ball and play to their defense. So there's just going to be some weeks where it's not going to come Cooper's way. You're just going to have to be patient and kind of let the whole season play out to get your true value out of it.
Yeah, I concur, right? Like there's a lot to that where so much boom bust kind of built in there that there was times it was hard to rely on Amari Cooper as even your wide receiver 2. And this is one of those that when he'll certainly see a lot of targets, right? Like, we very well may see him average in that 8-9 target range per game type of thing when it's all said and done. But that doesn't necessarily, kind of guarantee production or guarantee return on that one. Because we've seen this, in the past where, we can see 8 targets and it returns 34 yards in receiving yards there, right? With 0 touchdowns. And so I have 6 targets for 16 yards, right? Like there's a lot of these things that we've seen kind of come to light here and come to fruition there. So this is one of those that, again, like I'm not looking to necessarily put on Amari Cooper on my roster as my first wide receiver if I went some other directions with this. Amari Cooper, though, definitely some value in a wide receiver too, because I do think that we'll see some return on this one, and we can certainly see him finish inside of where his draft capital is, but we're also more likely to see him kind of return value where he's being drafted at wide receiver 25 overall. Any other thoughts on Amari Cooper? All right. Let's go ahead and take a look at Malik Neighbors. And Malik Neighbors last season didn't have any stats as an NFL professional because he's a rookie. Thoughts on Malik Neighbors?
Here's another guy I'm passing on at his current ADP, right? I like the talent. I like the prospect. I don't like where he's going. So until he falls drastically, this is a guy who I'm not actively searching out. Playing in a retooled New York Giants offense, it doesn't look like they're going to have much of a semblance of a run game. They still have offensive line woes. Daniel Jones is your quarterback. The kid's going to put up points, but I don't think he sneaks in the wide receiver 2 territory. Like I think this is a guy who's probably going, 2.5 rounds too early at least. And we really should have been talking about him further down the list, kind of where DeAndre Hopkins and Deontay Johnson are.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're probably spot on there, right? Like this is one of those that I think we're going to see Malik Neighbors struggle to clear 1,000 yards in receiving, right? This is a Giants offense that I don't think we're going to see many points put up. So I think we're going to see, not a ton of opportunities when it's all said and done to be able to put the ball into the end zone. And again, this is one of those that we haven't necessarily seen Daniel Jones emerge as a quarterback here that can propel and help develop wide receivers here. Like this is one that I'm very concerned about what this offense is going to look like and how it's going to work, and how they're going to try and move the ball. That being said, they very well could surprise me here, but I'd rather be surprised watching Malik Neighbors do it on somebody else's roster than watch him do it on my own roster. So this is one of those that I think you're right. I think we are seeing some overdrafting happening here, and is a guy that's almost on the do not draft list for me, just from where he's coming off the board for redraft, right? Dynasty, whole other story. I have no problem spending that first round capital on Malik Neighbors. But any other thoughts on Malik Neighbors?
No, sir.
All right. Let's go ahead and take a look at DK Metcalf. And DK Metcalf last season, 66 receptions, 119 targets, 1,114 yards, and 8 touchdowns. Thoughts on DK Metcalf?
I like DK Metcalf a lot this year, and I like where he's going right there at that 36 overall. So the end of the 3rd round, basically beginning of the 4th. I think there's some pretty good built-in value at DK and what he's doing. I like the fact that they're talking about moving him around the offense a little bit more, getting him in motion, helping free him up. Explosive freak athlete, right? No one's ever been able to say otherwise, but really getting some separation has been at times where the downfall is in the Seattle offense. But I think they're going to come in with new and creative ways to do this. So DK is a guy that I absolutely will take a flyer on. I like where he's going there at the 3-4 turn. So, knowing that I can get a DK in that range allows me to, not have to feel pinned into wide receiver at the back end of the first, beginning of the second. I can go running back and pick up a Jonathan Taylor and pair it up with, maybe a Puka Nacua, right? Something like that, and be able to kind of do that at the back end of the first, second, something of that nature. So I like DK, and I think he's going to have a really good season here. Wouldn't surprise me to see another guy finish inside the top 15, even possibly crack the top 12.
Right. DK is a guy that certainly has the talent to do that. It's all said and done. Like this is a guy that I feel like you're drafting him at his kind of absolute floor here. A guy that's, may not necessarily have a ton of upside. As far as value goes, because of coming off the board as wide receiver 23, I think it's likely that we see him finish kind of wide receiver 14, 15, kind of in that range. And this Seattle offense should look a lot different. I think we're going to see a little bit more pass happy. We're going to see a lot more passing offense here as well, because last season DK Metcalf had a monstrous target share when it was all said and done. But at the same time, like, it was a monstrous target share with only 114 targets when it was all said and done. So, this is one of those that I think we see more potential here as well. And with that increased potential, I think we can see him outperform that, and certainly drafting kind of basement value here for DK. So I really like the potential here for this season. Any other thoughts on DK? All right, let's go ahead and head over to Devonta Smith. And Devonta Smith last season, 81 targets, 81 receptions, 112 targets, 1,066 yards, and 7 touchdowns. Thoughts on Devonta Smith?
I like Smith. I think you're getting him with a little bit of value built in, right? So last 2 seasons, wide receiver 20 finish. The year before that, wide receiver 10 finish. In his rookie campaign, wide receiver 29. So, overall 22 as far as wide receiver position goes. I'm not opposed to this. He's another guy who's going at that 3-4 turn. So I think that, again, if you're doing something a little bit different there at the very top end of your draft, you have a guy that you can kind of fall back on here between Devonta Smith or DK Metcalf, who we just covered. So I like the guy. I like the offense. It's an offense that's going to put up some points. Defense was a little leaky last year, caused some shootouts. I know Philly's trying to plug some holes, but I wouldn't be surprised if we still see some of these shootouts here coming on with the Eagles. So Devonta Smith is a guy that I'm interested in looking at. It's definitely not a smash yes for me, but he is a guy that I'm going to be considering heavily coming into draft day.
Yeah, and there's a lot of things to like about Devonta Smith. Certainly has the talent and the ability to put up some big games and put up some good finishes for you over the course of a season. And again, a guy that you're probably drafting him at his floor here. And will likely return some value on this one. Some of that will kind of depend upon how this this Eagles offense kind of looks, right? Like, and works. There's going to be some differences in this, and there's some kind of key personnel changes that have happened here along the offensive front there that certainly could change how that kind of looks and works. And so I do think that we'll see some good value for Devonta Smith. I don't know that we see him drastically outperform this, but it wouldn't surprise me to see him get up into wide receiver 16, 17, 18, kind of in that range there. So I think there is some potential value there. And a guy that I wouldn't shy away from if it's when I'm sitting there on the draft, when I'm sitting there on the board and on the clock. Any other thoughts on Devonta Smith? All right, let's go ahead and take a look at Cooper Kupp. And Cooper Kupp last season, in a bit of an injury-shortened year, 59 receptions, 95 targets, 737 yards, and 5 touchdowns. Thoughts on Cooper Kupp?
I like the player, right? He's a fun guy to root for. He's a fun guy to watch. Again, another guy. I'm not opposed to this in where he's going, right? So, I think that his upside is very much so a guy that you could potentially see crack back inside the top 12. But a lot of that's going to depend on health, not only of him, but his offensive line and his quarterback. So there is some inherent risk with drafting Cooper Kupp. But overall, he's a guy that I find myself being comfortable with, and I'm willing to take the risk there and then try and make sure I build it in behind him. And I grab 1 or 2 of these other guys that we talked about here at the beginning of the night to make sure I have the depth to support an injury if it were to happen.
Yeah. And this is one of those that, I do start kind of looking at this point where we've seen 2 kind of lackluster seasons, and both of those injury shortened seasons for Cooper Kupp. Cooper Kupp, certainly getting up there in kind of that age and that age range where we tend to start seeing the slowdown happen on that one. And so there is some of that there is some of that concern for me when I'm looking at it. Um, looking at it that way, you know, he had some when he was healthy and he was playing, he had some really good target share. It didn't necessarily equate to a ton of like blow up weeks and a ton of points there because there was some of those weeks where we saw a lot of targets and it still be a very ho hum lackluster fantasy finish there, right? Like week 8 against Dallas, 10 targets, wide receiver 87 finish. Week 16, New Orleans, 12 targets and finished wide receiver 52 on the week. So yeah, there is some concern there with that, but there is also that potential upside that you spoke of, and certainly a lot of options there as well because this is still Matthew Stafford's guy and where he'll look and target to, and he certainly has no problem kind of forcing the ball in there at 10 opportunities a game, and there is some of that when it's all said and done, opportunities are a lot of what you're drafting when it's sitting there, and so I do like that thought that if you're going to take the risk on Cooper Kupp and take the chance on the opportunities that are coming that way to kind of take some additional steps right behind that as well to kind of bolster that roster up and kind of mitigate that risk a little bit. So I like that. I don't necessarily have a problem going with Cooper Kupp. I like the potential. I like the upside, and I don't necessarily mind the risk, but I am going to be backing that up and mitigating that risk in the next couple of rounds there as well. Any other thoughts on Cooper Kupp?
No, sir.
Awesome. Well, that takes us down to the end of the list here. Any other thoughts on any of the wide receivers that we rock and roll through?
I don't think so. Good group of wide receivers, right? Like a lot of guys that we're high on, a lot of guys where we feel like there's value in, but definitely some areas where both you and I felt like there's a potential landmine. So, um, these are great depth pieces, and not just depth, but starting lineup pieces, right? So making sure you understand your roster construct is key. But we are here to help with all that. So if you ever have any questions, you saw them coming in here tonight, a couple of them. So whether it's trades, whether it's a draft question, roster construction, obviously we'll be touching on free agency as the season gets started. But thank you all for tuning in. But be sure to hit us up at Good Old Boys FF wherever you guys consume your social media content, and then head on over to the YouTube and give us a like and subscribe here, so that way you guys can get the latest and greatest from the boys.
All righty. And on that note, I like it. Alex, hopefully we'll see him back next week, but that's going to do it for us. He's Kevin. I'm Derek. Have a good one. Be safe. Toodaloos.